Section 2 of The Making of the British Empire by Arthur Hassel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. The Ministry of Sir Robert Walpole, 1721 to 1742. The years of Walpole's ministry form an important period in English history. He secured for England nearly 20 years of peace and prosperity, saw the firm establishment of the Hanoverian dynasty on the throne, and fostered an enormous development in the wealth and commerce of the country. A Norfolk squire of good family, endowed with excellent business capacities, sound judgment, and tact, Walpole had early shown that he possessed those qualities which fit a man for governing a country. He would have been an ideal prime minister but for his too cynical tongue and his jealousy of all possible rivals. Born in 1676, he had not completed his 45th year when he was called upon in April 1721 to take the offices of First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. These offices he held, with one short break, for 21 years, and during his ministry he saw several important constitutional changes quietly effected. Owing to the continued absence of George I from the meetings of the Cabinet, Walpole became recognized as Prime Minister. The modern conception of monarchy was generally accepted, and a great step was taken in the development of the modern theory of the Cabinet itself. It became, during Walpole's long tenure of office, a united body, the members of which acted together and met under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister. Of Walpole's colleagues, the principal were Townshend and Carteret, the two Secretaries of State, and Pulteney, who accepted the office of Cofferer or Treasurer to the King's household. Of these, Townshend remained in the ministry till 1730. Walpole, describing the government during these years as the firm of Townshend and Walpole. In foreign politics, Townshend took considerable interest and was much in favour of elaborate coalitions. Carteret, one of the best foreign ministers of the century, was able, by his knowledge of the German tongue and of continental politics, to ingratiate himself with both George I and George II. William Pulteney, a brilliant debater, was destined, like Shelburne and Charles James Fox, to spend the greater part of his political career in opposition. The first duty of the new ministry was to deal with a Jacobite conspiracy in which Atterbury, the Bishop of Rochester, was the leading spirit. The detection of this plot was followed by a bill of pains and penalties, and the deprivation and banishment of Atterbury himself. In June 1723, on his departure from England, he met at Dover Bolingbroke, who had lately been pardoned and allowed to return to his native country. In 1724 Walpole and Carteret quarrelled. The latter had inherited from Sunderland, who died in 1722, his personal dislike for Walpole and Townshend, with the natural result that it became impossible for him to continue to hold the important office of Secretary of State. He therefore became Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, remaining in the Cabinet until 1730, his Secretaryship of State being given to the Duke of Newcastle, while Henry Pelham became Secretary at War. On his arrival in Ireland, Carteret found the whole country in fierce opposition to the grant to an English ironmaster named Wood of a patent to issue a new copper coinage. The need of the new copper coinage was undoubted, but the patent having been given by the English government, and for an Englishman's profit, the patriotism of Irishmen was aroused. Swift skilfully fomented the agitation by his Drapier's letters, and by Carteret's advice the patent was at length withdrawn. Till the end of Walpole's career, Ireland gave the English government no further trouble. Till 1725, with the temporary suppression of the Jacobite plots, the subjection of Carteret, the pacification of the ferment in Ireland, Walpole had found the course of politics to run fairly smoothly. But the year 1725 brought with it anxieties both at home and abroad. In that year William Pulteney retired from the government, and Spain and Austria, trusting in the Treaty of Vienna, threatened England's ascendancy in the Mediterranean and her growing commercial supremacy. The retirement of Pulteney was followed by his union with Bolingbroke, in an attempt to unite all the elements of opposition to Walpole into one powerful body capable of overthrowing the ministry. The existence of many discontented Whigs, of a large body of constitutional or Hanoverian Tories under Sir William Windham, and of some 50 Jacobites under Shippen, gave an admirable opportunity for the efforts of men as able and vindictive as were Pulteney and Bolingbroke. On December 5th, 1726, appeared the first number of the Craftsman, a famous opposition newspaper which, till April 17th, 1736, continued each week to attack the minister on all points of foreign and domestic policy. While Pulteney, at the head of the discontented Whigs, and Windham, supported by the Hanoverian Tories, made frequent assaults on Walpole in Parliament, Bolingbroke devoted his efforts to exciting the country against the government. Of the many subjects upon which the opposition seized in order to harass the minister, that of foreign politics offered exceptional opportunities for attack. The alliance between Spain and Austria, concluded in May 1725, had two principal objects: the support of the Ostend East India Company, which was designed to strike at the English commercial supremacy in India and China, and the recovery of Gibraltar from Spain. The company, which had in 1722 received formal recognition by the Emperor, proposed to form a commercial establishment in the Austrian Netherlands, and to open trade between that country and the East. An ill-advised letter written by George I had raised the hopes of Spain with regard to Gibraltar. To the pretensions of the courts of Vienna and Madrid, public feeling in England offered a determined resistance, and in September 1725 the League of Hanover was formed by England, France, and Prussia, joined later by Sweden, Denmark, and Holland. Europe was thus divided into two camps, and the outbreak of a general war seemed inevitable. Hostilities, however, only took place between England and Spain. Gibraltar, though attacked, was successfully defended, while Admiral Hosier watched English interests in the West Indies. The Emperor soon realized that the Spanish alliance was for Austria an unnatural one, and as soon as Spain discovered that the death of George I was not followed by any change of policy, she also assumed a more pacific attitude. George died, entirely unregretted by his subjects, while travelling to his beloved electorate of Hanover on June 10th, 1727. For a few weeks Walpole was superseded by Sir Spencer Compton, Speaker of the House of Commons, a great favourite of the new king. The incapacity of Compton, and the confidence and friendship which the new Queen, a very able woman, felt for Walpole, secured the reinstatement of the fallen minister and a continuance of the home and foreign policy of the late reign. George II was, like his father, devoted to Hanover and Hanoverian politics. He was a brave soldier and had seen service under Marlborough, and was an honest man, loyal to all those in whom he had placed confidence. His wife, Queen Caroline, was a woman of considerable force of character and deeply interested in literature and politics. She was a strong supporter of Walpole, and having an unbounded influence over the king, secured for the ministry during her lifetime an immunity from all anxiety concerning its tenure of power. In 1728 a congress at Soissons met to try and settle the many complicated questions which then distracted Europe. It proved a failure, and in 1729 England, France, and Spain made the Treaty of Seville. Spain virtually resigned all claim to Gibraltar and Minorca, and the English privilege of trade, as well as the asiento (footnote), monopoly of the right to import negro slaves into Spanish America, were confirmed. England and France, on their part, supported the eventual succession of Don Carlos, the son of Elizabeth Farnese, Queen of Spain, to the duchies of Parma, Piacenza, and Tuscany. The Anglo-French alliance thus remained undisputed, and Fleury, the French minister, hoped that Spain, which had again broken with Austria, would trust to the maritime powers for satisfaction with regard to her claims in Italy. The Emperor, now left isolated, was furious at the Treaty of Seville. He refused to entertain the idea of relinquishing his rights over the Italian duchies, and when, in January 1731, the Duke of Parma died, he marched troops into Italy, and matters were brought to a crisis. A European war was inevitable if Spanish troops, in accordance with the Treaty of Seville, were landed in Italy. Walpole was now supreme in the cabinet. In 1730 Carteret had resigned his Lord Lieutenancy of Ireland and joined the opposition, and Townshend had retired from the government. For some time past the relations between Townshend and Walpole had tended to become strained. Walpole had never approved of Townshend's foreign policy, of which the Treaty of Hanover was an example. Townshend had been much irritated at Walpole's habit of allowing objectionable bills to pass the Commons, and leaving the onus of throwing them out to be borne by the Lords. Supreme in the cabinet, Walpole with great skill managed to preserve the peace of Europe in 1731. While the basis of his foreign policy was the French alliance, the opposition severely criticised the Treaty of Seville and England's alienation from Austria. Led by Pulteney and Wyndham, the attacks on the government never ceased. It was pointed out that Austria, a country without colonies or a fleet, and since 1688 closely connected with England, was the true ally of this country, and that France and Spain were our real foes. In return for a promise to guarantee the Pragmatic Sanction, an instrument assuring to Maria Theresa, Charles VI.'s daughter and heiress, the possession of all the Habsburg dominions, the Emperor consented to withdraw his troops, and to allow Don Carlos to enter into possession of Parma and Piacenza. In 1732, the Second Treaty of Vienna, concluded by the Emperor with England, Holland, and Spain, settled all the difficulties which had disturbed Europe for many years, and seemed to ensure the continuance of peace. In spite, however, of the more settled foreign outlook, and in spite of the apparently strong position of the government at home, the year 1733 saw the ministry shaken and Europe involved in a great war. Walpole had long wished to conciliate the country gentlemen by lowering the land tax. He therefore proposed an excise on salt, the proceeds of which would enable him to reduce the land tax to 1 shilling. In 1733 he further determined, in order to prevent smuggling, to collect the duties on wine and tobacco in the form of an excise from the retailers. In other words, he proposed to transfer wine and tobacco from the customs to the excise, levying no taxes on goods merely imported for re-exportation. Footnote. Customs are paid at the seaports when goods are brought into the country. Excise is paid when goods are sent about within the country. In England, the idea of an excise had been, ever since the Civil War, most unpopular. A violent agitation at once sprang up against Walpole's scheme. The opposition, aided by the craftsmen, inveighed against the government, the members of which were not united on the question, and Walpole yielded to the storm and withdrew the excise bill. The opposition had gained its first success, and in the Parliament of 1735 Walpole's majority was reduced. In Scotland, the next year witnessed the Porteous riots, which without judicious management might have had serious consequences. At the execution of a smuggler named Wilson, Porteous, captain of the Edinburgh City Guard, fired on a riotous crowd, and being tried for murder, he was condemned to death. His sentence being commuted by the English government, the mob stormed the prison and hanged him. With considerable judgment, Walpole punished the city of Edinburgh by merely levying a fine to be paid to the widow of Porteous, and Scotland, like Ireland, gave little trouble to the English government till the rising of the Highlanders in 1745. During these years the Polish Succession War was being waged on the Continent. It broke out in 1733 nominally over the question of the election of the King of Poland, but it soon resolved itself into a struggle between the Bourbon powers of France and Spain on the one hand, and Austria, supported by Russia and the German states, on the other. The Russians and Austrians had little difficulty in expelling from Poland the French candidate, Stanislav Leszczynski, the father of Louis XV's wife, and placing Augustus of Saxony on the throne. But in Italy and on the Rhine the Austrians were not so successful. Exposed to the attacks of the French, Spaniards, and Sardinians, the Habsburgs quickly lost their hold on southern Italy, while their possessions in northern Italy were seriously threatened. On the Rhine, Philipsburg was taken in 1734 by the French, and Lorraine and the Electorate of Trèves occupied. During these years England remained neutral, in spite of the anxiety of the king, supported by the Queen, the majority of the cabinet, and the nation, to respond to the urgent appeals of the court of Vienna and take part in the war. It was asserted that England ought to oppose the aggrandisement of the Bourbon powers of France and Spain, both of which were animated by jealousy of the British supremacy on the sea. Austria was England's ancient ally, and the opposition criticised with virulence Walpole's disregard of the growing strength of the Bourbons. It is true that on November 7th, 1733, France and Spain had concluded the Treaty of the Escurial, a solemn family compact between the two branches of the House of Bourbon. By the terms of this treaty, both nations were to oppose England's commercial aggressions and her attempts at colonial expansion. Though Walpole was aware of the existence of this family compact, he remained steadily in favour of a policy of non-intervention, which proved of the greatest advantage to France and Spain, no less than to England. He was convinced that England's entry into the war would endanger the Hanoverian succession, would unsettle trade, and would check her colonial and commercial development. "Madam," he said one morning in 1734 to the Queen, "there are 50,000 men slain this year in Europe, and not one Englishman." The Dutch were resolved to remain neutral, and Walpole was undoubtedly influenced in his peace policy by their resolution. Without the co-operation of the United Provinces, he was determined not to adopt the offensive. All his energies were devoted to bringing about a general pacification. His diplomacy, aided by the advance of 16,000 Russians to the Rhine, and by quarrels between the Spaniards and Sardinians, was successful, and in 1735 the preliminaries of the Third Treaty of Vienna were signed. France secured the reversion of the Duchy of Lorraine, Don Carlos became king of the two Sicilies, Naples and Sicily, and Sardinia secured fresh additions of territory. Austria had succeeded in her aims in Poland, but she had lost heavily elsewhere, and came out of the struggle considerably weakened. After the election of 1735, Bolingbroke, despairing of being able to overthrow Walpole, retired to France, and his political connection with Pulteney came to an end. The opposition to the Prime Minister, however, relaxed none of its violence, and reinforced by clever young men such as William Pitt and George Grenville, the "Boys," as they were called, rallied round Frederick, Prince of Wales, who was involved in endless quarrels with his father. In 1737 Queen Caroline died, and Walpole lost his most powerful supporter. From this time his difficulties increased. Taking advantage of the privilege conferred on England in 1716 of sending an annual ship to trade with Spanish America, English traders had engaged in extensive smuggling operations, and in consequence the Spanish officials had exercised, often with undue severity, their rights of search. The English merchants in the Spanish guardacostas had for many years been engaged in intermittent hostilities, when in 1738 the famous Captain Jenkins informed Parliament how some 7 years previously his ear had been torn off by the Spanish naval officer who searched his ship for contraband goods. This story provoked great indignation. The opposition seized the opportunity of weakening the government, appealed to the country, and in Parliament attacked Walpole's endeavours to arrive by peaceable means at a satisfactory understanding with Spain. War became inevitable, and was declared in October 1739, amid the greatest enthusiasm. "Ah, they are ringing the bells to-day," said Walpole. "They will soon be wringing their hands." Admiral Vernon was sent to attack the Spanish West Indies, where he took Portobello, but failed to capture Cartagena, while Commodore Anson was dispatched round Cape Horn to attack the Spanish settlements on the Pacific. In consequence of Vernon's want of success, and of Anson's long absence, extending over 4 years, the country soon ceased to take any interest in the war with Spain. Far greater attention was concentrated on England's efforts to defend Maria Theresa, who had, on the death of Charles VI. in 1740, succeeded to the possession of the Austrian dominions, from the unprovoked attacks of Prussia, France, Spain, Sardinia, Saxony, and Bavaria. On Charles VI.'s death in 1740, Frederick the Great, the young King of Prussia, determined to take advantage of the weakened condition of Austria and to seize Silesia. This piratical plan he carried out after the Battle of Mollwitz on April 10, 1741. Encouraged by his success, all the enemies of Austria determined to partition the Habsburg dominions, and to make the Elector of Bavaria Emperor, and not Maria Theresa's husband, Francis of Lorraine. Russia, being occupied by internal matters, and later by a war with Sweden, was unable to offer the court of Vienna any assistance. But in England the cause of the young Queen Maria Theresa was taken up with the utmost enthusiasm. Though Germany was invaded and Prague captured by a mixed force of French, Bavarians, and Saxons in 1741, Maria Theresa, by means of the loyalty of the Hungarians, was able before the end of the year to hold her own against her numerous foes. George II., as Elector of Hanover, was by no means averse to the election of Charles Albert of Bavaria as Emperor, but was hostile to Prussian aggrandisement. Walpole, on the other hand, recognized that the best solution would be the acceptance by Maria Theresa of the loss of Silesia. Between 1740 and 1742 he struggled to keep peace with France. England was at war with Spain, and war with France would, he was convinced, be followed by a Jacobite rebellion. As the designs of the Bourbons and the Allies were gradually unfolded, he realized that their best way to oppose France was by bringing about peace between Prussia and Austria, and by forming a league of German states. The dismemberment of Austria was therefore to be prevented, and during his last months of office Walpole laboured to persuade Maria Theresa to cede Silesia to Prussia, and Frederick the Great to retire from the coalition which had been formed against Austria. All chance of a pacific solution of the European imbroglio was destroyed when Parliament, in May 1741, voted £300,000 for the maintenance of the Pragmatic Sanction, and when France decided to join Prussia in an attack on Austria. But Walpole was no war minister. No adequate preparations had been made in the event of the outbreak of hostilities, and no vigour characterized the naval or military operations. In November 1741, it became known that George II, in the previous April, had made with France a treaty for the neutrality of Hanover for 1 year, and the Ministry became more and more unpopular. Walpole ought to have resigned in 1739 on the outbreak of the war with Spain, which he described as unjust, impolitic, and dishonourable. And though in 1741 he wisely urged a pacification between Frederick the Great and the Empress Queen, his counsels no longer carried weight. Before circumstances compelled Maria Theresa to adopt Walpole's views, that minister's political career had closed. After the general election of 1741, Walpole's majority was reduced to 16, and on February 2nd, 1742, the Ministry was defeated on a motion on the Chippenham election petition. The fall of Walpole, says Ranke, was not the fall of an ordinary statesman, but the fall of the political system based upon the first union of the House of Hanover and the Regent of France. His ministry forms a parenthesis in the oft-recurring struggle between England and France, which, beginning in 1688, continued till 1815. Peace being absolutely necessary for the firm establishment of the Hanoverian dynasty on the English throne, the French alliance became of necessity the key to all Walpole's foreign policy. He had to provide against the possibility of a Jacobite invasion, and a French alliance was therefore requisite. Bolingbroke, Shelburne, and the younger Pitt, till 1792, in like manner preferred the French to the German systems, which found advocates in Sunderland, Carteret, the elder Pitt, and Charles James Fox. In domestic politics, Walpole was equally anxious to procure political tranquillity. He thought that after a great change, such as the accession of the Hanoverian line, important and contentious measures were inopportune. Much may be said in favour of his policy. Great constitutional reforms were not a pressing need, and the second quarter of the 18th century was in truth the period of preparation for the immense colonial and industrial expansion which was to begin under the elder Pitt. Walpole persisted in his endeavours to win over the country gentlemen by lowering the land tax. He refused to stir up the hostility of churchmen by repealing the Test Act. His tact in regard to Wood's halfpence and the Porteous riots checked disaffection in Ireland and Scotland. His financial policy was equally wise. In 1730 he passed an act allowing the planters of Georgia and Carolina to export their rice directly to any port in Europe south of Finisterre, provided they sent it in British ships manned by British sailors. Other colonial restrictions were removed, and the West Indian traders were immensely benefited. Under his rule, England's material advancement was enormous, and the growth of her colonial trade was striking. His excise scheme was admirably conceived, and later in the century became law. He reduced the customs duties and the national debt, and in many similar ways increased the comfort of the people. His relations with Parliament and the Cabinet have left their mark on constitutional history. The House of Commons began to assume that position of supremacy in our political system which it now holds, and a long stride was made towards establishing the principles of the collective and mutual responsibility of ministers to the House of Commons, of the political homogeneity and solidarity of the Cabinet, and of the supremacy of the Prime Minister, principles which are now understood to be essential to Cabinet government. Walpole, said Burke, was an honourable man and a sound Whig. Though Walpole, the first leader of the House of Commons in a modern sense, undoubtedly practised parliamentary corruption, it is not true that he organised corruption as a system. Ever since Charles II's accession, corruption had been on the increase, and was regularly practised on many occasions. Crown patronage was exclusively reserved by Walpole for members of his own party. but in this and other matters he acted in accordance with the political customs of his day. Of systematic corruption on behalf of his supporters or for the benefit of himself there is no adequate proof. His ministry was not likely to create any enthusiasm. Absolute master of the House of Commons, he restored confidence to all classes, and owed no little of his power to the moneyed interest. He had no sympathy with religion or with literature, though he endeavoured to use the services of pamphleteers for political purposes. His treatment of the Church of England had disastrous results, for the lifeless Christianity of the reigns of the first two Georges, and the absence of church development at a time when the population was beginning to transfer itself to new centres in the great towns and in the colonies, Walpole and the Whigs were directly answerable. At home his policy of quiete non movere was not unwelcome to a nation bent on seeking material prosperity, and averse to political or social upheavals. In 1742, however, the country ceased to be content with a foreign policy which had for its main object the maintenance of the balance of power and the terms of the Peace of Utrecht. Colonial expansion demanded a more adventurous system, and under Wilmington, the Pelhams, and Pitt, England not only established her own empire, but contributed to the settlement of Europe, which had been stirred to its depths by Frederick the Great's seizure of Silesia. England owes her successes by sea and by land between 1742 and 1763 in no small measure to the wise administration of her great peace minister. End of section 2.